Good evening. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Exodus from Egypt, the first Lanier Theological Library presentation at LCU. We're so excited about this evening, and we're so glad that you are here. In fact, we have had an overwhelming response from the Lubbock community. Initially, we had planned this lecture across the mall in the Baker Conference Center, which only seats 400 or so, a little less. And we have had over 990 reservations called in, so that's awesome. It really is wonderful, isn't it? My name is Jesse Long. I am the Dean of the College of Biblical Studies and Behavioral Sciences. And we are excited about this evening's program. Thank you for helping us make this really a special event, a memorable event in the life of Lubbock Christian University. Dr. Ken Jones, Chancellor of LCU, will now extend further words of welcome and will introduce our special guest, Mark Lanier.
Wow, we are really, really thrilled to have each of you here with us tonight on the campus of Lubbock Christian University. We're thrilled to have you here in the McDonald Moody Auditorium. It's just a special night for all of us. I have the opportunity tonight to introduce Mark Lanier. Many of you in this audience know him really well because you watched him grow up. He grew up here in Lubbock, grew up over at the Broadway congregation. It may be that his mother is more famous than he, in that Carolyn Lanier is known as the one who founded the South Plains Food Bank, and the South Plains Food Bank has made its mark across the world. So, and I will tell you that Mark left Lubbock and went over to David Lipscomb University and got his bachelor's degree in religion, and became an expert in the languages, Hebrew and Greek, and came back to Lubbock, came back home and went to Texas Tech Law School. And I want to tell you first that he is really, really a special attorney. He has made his name as one of the top trial attorneys in America and beyond America. I was with a group Friday night in Houston at the Houston Rockets game, courtesy of Mark Lanier. And a fellow walked into the room, and he was a long time ago graduate of Lubbock Christian College, and had all kinds of stories to tell us, very prominent attorney in that area. And he said, I call Mark pretty often. He said, every time I get a difficult client, I say to them, Mark Lanier's going to handle this for me. And he said, there's just a silence on the phone. And the conclusion was, everybody's afraid of him. He is such a powerful attorney. He has an unusual courtroom appearance and ability to communicate. Mark, we commend you for that. But he has a love for Scripture. That fits so well at Lubbock Christian University because here we have a very, very high view and high respect of Scripture. And Mark founded with his wife the Lanier Theological Library, and it is kind of an unbelievable place. He buys collections of some of the greatest theologians in the world and brings them intact and puts them into this library, and it's an amazing thing. And he brings speakers in regularly to talk about some of the most difficult things that we find in Scripture and explains them so very, very well. What I really want to tell you is this. Mark teaches a Bible class virtually every Sunday morning. I think I got this right, at the Champions Forest Baptist Church, or Forest Champions. I never know which one it is, but it's close, okay? I slipped into that class a few weeks ago, and it was an unbelievable expository lesson from the book of Habakkuk. And you know, sometimes you hear a lesson, you may remember a thought for a little while. Once in a while, just occasionally, you'll hear a thought from someone's presentation that just stays with you. Mark, I want you to know that I will never, ever hear the words, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him." Never hear it again without thinking about what you said and how you explained that from the Hebrew language and what an impression it made on me. He loves Scripture. And he's the reason why we're able to bring such a special gift to our campus tonight. And there are going to be more guests like this. Mark is a great friend of Lubbock Christian University, serves on our foundation board. Mark, I am so delighted that you're here tonight. Will you join me in welcoming Mr. Mark Lanier?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's a delight to be here. I do love this school. I love this place. This is the first time I got to speak publicly to a large group. I was in high school, and John King here at Lubbock Christian asked me to come address 1,000 or so people on a night in this auditorium. So this has a very warm place in my heart. It's especially warm tonight because I get to introduce to you Dr. Jim Hoffmeier. I met Dr. Hoffmeier because I was troubled by something. I was working through the Exodus, trying to put it together to teach, and I was particularly troubled by the idea that there were 600,000 men of fighting age in the Exodus. And I was reading works from Israel Finkelstein and others who are on the Discovery Channel and who say that there's no historical validity to the Exodus. They say that there's no archaeological evidence. And they say if there were 600,000 men of fighting age, when you add all of the women, you add all the older men, you add all the younger men, you're going to have 3 to 4 million people. And 3 to 4 million people cannot march for 40 years in some place as small as Sinai without there being at least one shred of archaeological evidence. I thought that's a compelling argument. So I need to know what evidence there is. Well, I started looking at books, and there are books by all sorts of people who have some level of merit, I'm sure, to what they are, but they didn't impress me really with their scholarship, and I wasn't appreciative of what they had written necessarily. And then I came across 3 books, one by a man named Ken Kitchen, who is one of the world's leading Egyptologists, and the other 2 books by Jim Hoffmeier, who in my opinion is the other world's leading Egyptologist on matters such as this without any question. These were books published by Oxford University Press. Jim had his degrees, his graduate degrees from the University of Toronto, one of the world's top Egyptology schools. And I read these with interest because they were footnoted precisely. The lawyer in me wanted that, needed that. If there's one thing that bothers me, it's reading something without a footnote when I have no basis for knowing if it's true or not, and I just don't like to believe anybody, except Mom and my wife and Jim. But I only grew to believe Jim because I checked all his footnotes, and I found out he's a dead-on accurate scholar who explained not only that, but went so much deeper that I had to seek him out and I had to get to know him. I invited him to come lecture at our library in Houston. He came and he presented the lecture. I thought the lecture was so profound. I said, would you consider coming to Lubbock, presenting it in my hometown to my friends at LCU? He said he'd be glad to. And he made an arduous trip in here to do this simply because of his love for the material and his love for God's people. Because Jim is not just an academician. He's not simply an Egyptologist who, don't get me wrong, he doesn't simply live in an ivory tower. Summer after summer after summer, he's out there doing the work in Egypt, overseeing the Sinai excavations and the digs. Many of the slides you'll see tonight are pictures he took or that were taken at his request on his digs. He's got firsthand knowledge. He was born in Egypt. Go to the airport with him and you get in security trouble because just to be obnoxious. He speaks Arabic all the time, walking around the airport. He grew up with it. He knows his foreign languages. He knows his ancient languages. He teaches students how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs for their PhD. This is a man who is a scholar par excellence, but the most important thing I can tell you is he loves the Lord with all of his heart, soul, and mind. He loves his family, and he loves his neighbor, not just as himself, but better than himself. He's a tremendous individual, and God is molding every day more so and more so into the shape and character of Christ. And it's an honor to get to see him and to know him. Certainly an honor to get to listen to him tonight. Jim, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you all for being here tonight. I guess there's not much going on in Lubbock on a Monday night. You know, one of the great things about being an archaeologist, I've told a lot of people this, but you know, from the start, your career lies in ruins. Just, what can I say? One last wisecrack. The word Exodus, that's on our screen that we hear so much about, is actually the Greek word that means exit. So if we were in Greece today, although that's not the best place to be either, when you look over at the exit sign, it would actually say Exodus in Greek. Because this is really the story about the Exodus, the exiting of the Israelites from Egypt. Now, of course, before they exited, they had to get there. And we know from the Bible they stayed there quite a bit of years. Now, you would think something that is so thoroughly treated in the Bible, and by the way, it's hard to find a page of Scripture that in some way does not allude to the Exodus, whether it's Psalms, whether it's the prophets, whether it's historical books, whether it's the laws of ancient Israel, the Exodus is there. So, you would think that this would be one area where scholars could agree. In fact, as recently as 1981, in the third edition of his book, A History of Israel, John Bright said regarding the Exodus, virtually no one today would question the Exodus. Well, he didn't live long enough to see what's happened the last 25 years. But in terms of ancient Israel, and any knowledge of ancient Israel from ancient Egyptian records is this famous slab of stone called a stela, the stela of King Merneptah. Merneptah was the pharaoh who succeeded Ramses the Great. Ramses the Great being the 67-year reigning monarch of Egypt. Some of you may know him as Yul Brynner in the movies. As Professor Kenneth Kitchen says, how do you succeed Ramses II? Well, first of all, if Dad reigned 67 years, you start off as an old man. But Merneptah was at least around long enough to conduct one military campaign about the year 1208 BC, and he went into the land of Canaan and fought a group of people, among others, called Israel. So we do know that there was a people living in the land of Canaan by 1208 BC called Israel. We don't know much more about them because we actually have no documentation of the Israelites in Egypt. I hate to tell you this. There is no text, I've never found it, saying Moses slept here. This doesn't exist. It took me 10 years to convince my benefactor we were not going to find it either. Now, mention was made just moments ago about Israel Finkelstein, and some of you may have unwittingly bought this book thinking, oh, this is a great book about the Bible on earth. What a great idea. And in this book, he says, and this is a quote, the historical saga contained in the Bible, from Abraham's encounter with God and his journey to Canaan to Moses and the deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage, is a brilliant product of the human imagination. A brilliant product, and this is an Israeli. I mean, his name is Israel. He's an Israeli archaeologist. Now, you would think the last people in the world who would not want to buy into this would be the Israelites or Jews today. But that's really what many people are thinking today. Now, my approach to the text, and I mentioned this briefly to a group of people before our talk here tonight, is my approach to the Bible is the same as my approach to any ancient Near Eastern text. As a historian, if I'm reading an Egyptian text like the Merneptah stele we just looked at, if Merneptah says, I fought against a people called Israel, I have no reason to doubt that. I treat it as innocent until proven guilty. Many today treat the Bible as being guilty until proven innocent, which doesn't seem fair because who's around to prove it? Who lived back then? What I like to do is to explore what I consider the background evidence. What is there that we can look at in the biblical narratives that archaeology can provide some of the setting, the background information? And the more I've studied this material, and that's really what prompted me to write these books, is because so much of the criticism was coming from biblical scholars who don't know ancient Egypt. And so as an Egyptologist, I said, listen, I better go into this because I'm interested in the Bible, and most Egyptologists could care less. They're so focused on Egypt, they don't have any time for anything else. So what I'd like to do tonight is to basically look at two areas of the biblical story. One, of course, has to do with the passage here in Exodus 1, 11 and 14, which talks about the enslavement that the Israelites experienced. And then we're going to look a little bit at some of the geography of the Exodus. So those will be our two focal points tonight. Now, Exodus 1:11, we'll be talking about verse 11 a little bit more, but this is the reference to the beginning of the oppression. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them, the Hebrews, to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. And they made their lives bitter, verse 14 picks up, with hard service in mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. So we see the forced labor or the enslavement the Hebrews experienced fell into two areas: construction, building, brick making, and the second area would be agriculture. Now the question is there any evidence that this sort of thing actually happened? And so what I like to do is to look at some of the background information we have from Egypt. This is a picture looking inside the tomb of one of the prime ministers of Egypt in the 15th century. His name is Rechmireh, and there's a red arrow, maybe you can faintly see it, pointing up to this register up here where, by the way, I just thought I'd show you the entrance to the tomb, but this is the entrance to the tomb of the king, and Rechmireh, who's the prime minister, I'm sorry. That's not him standing there, in case you were wondering. But on that panel, inside that rock-cut tomb, we have these splendidly painted scenes in which there's all kinds of interesting technology at work. But at this bottom register here, you can actually see a group of workers making bricks. Here they are. Here you can see a man pressing mud into the brick mold, mud being moved around, bricks after they're drying being stacked up. Here's another brick layer making the bricks, and mud being poured out for the brick maker. They're being hauled away in yokes. Here's just another picture at the very end. You can see them dipping water out of a pool, mixing it with the clay to make the brick. You see all the bricks laid out, and on we have this going. Now, I enlarge the man in the center who is carrying a yoke on his shoulder, and notice this yoke is to carry loads of bricks. I'm reminded in Hosea 11 how God reminds Israel that I was the one who lifted the yoke off your shoulders when you were in Egypt. They literally wore yokes to move bricks around. Now, just above that man's head, there's a faint inscription, and that faint inscription tells us that the workers were part of the booty, prisoners of war, if you will, booty brought back from the campaigns of Pharaoh. Now, you may not be sitting close enough to see this, but I'm familiar with the scene enough that if you looked at these workers closely, you would see that there are different racial makeups to these different workers. Some are black-skinned Africans from the king's campaigns down the Nile into what is today Sudan. There are also lighter-skinned persons with beards and so on, And these are people who've taken prisoners of war from his campaigns in what we know today as Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, ancient Canaan and Syria. So we know that here in the 15th century BC, and for the next 200 years, as the Egyptian pharaohs launched out on military campaigns, they bring back POWs. And what they do with the POWs, they were pressed into labor for the state. And here's what we see them doing: making bricks for temple building projects. We're told that they built store cities, literally in Hebrew, store cities. That sort of doesn't compute. But in Hebrew thought, a city is anything that has a wall around it. It doesn't have to be big. So what you're looking at, nice aerial balloon shot, is the funerary temple of Ramses II, the man who we've talked about who reigned 67 years. Beautiful shot. But what you can see is the main temple right in here, there all the tourists go to see. And after you have your picture taken with Ozymandias, the huge big granite statue, everybody jumps on the tour bus and leaves. If you come with me, I'll take you around back and show you all these brick facilities. There's a look on the ground. And here are the remnants, believe it or not, of a 3,300-year-old vaulted arched mud brick storage facilities. Amazing that they've lasted. There's virtually no rain in southern Egypt. Northern Egypt, where the Israelites worked, the land of Goshen, on the other hand, is very moist due to both rain and the annual flood. I've heard some Egyptologists say, well, if the Hebrews were there, surely we'd have some records of them, which bothers me a little bit because that Egyptologist should know that after 200 years of archaeology in the delta of Egypt, not one papyrus document from pharaonic times has survived. And that's simply because of environmental considerations. It's moist, it's damp, it doesn't survive. It's just like the difference if you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls where they were found at Qumran and compare that to Jerusalem. No documents survive in Jerusalem where it's moist and rains and snows. Down at the Dead Sea where it's dry, manuscripts can last forever. Same thing in Egypt. So in the south of Egypt, had the Israelites been there, which is, by the way, is 400 miles south of Cairo, so almost 500 miles south of the land of Goshen, we might have something. So we have to be realistic in what we think archaeology can do and can't do. But here we see the storage facilities. Now, these facilities would have been attached to palaces and temples. Here it's a funerary temple, but palaces would have had these. Temples for living gods, not dead kings in this case. So these sort of facilities would have been all over Egypt, wherever you have palaces and wherever you have temples. And that was in a lot of places. So as you can see, a structure like this would require lots and lots of bricks. Just a close-up of a brick, a mud brick. And this one, if you look very closely, actually does have straw in it. When we read of Moses approaching Pharaoh and asking for a 3-day religious holiday, of course, Pharaoh rebuffs him by saying, well, I don't know this God, Yahweh, Jehovah, so I'm not going to let you go. Something interesting now we know about Egypt that was not known all that much in the past, and that is that the ancient Egyptians did not have a 7-day week. We think that that's so common that everybody has a week, surely, and then you get a weekend, right? It's as American as apple pie. In ancient Egypt, they actually had a 10-day work cycle. You have 3 10-day work cycles a month, 30 days a month, and no weekends. The only time the workers got off was for religious holidays. And what you're looking at here is an actual flake of limestone that has a work roster list, and there's an entire leather scroll in the Louvre in Paris that has a work roster. And what's so interesting about these documents is they tell us, and this was for payment purposes, but we find out on that leather scroll in the Louvre that people were actually given religious holidays. And so worker X isn't here today because he had a personal religious holiday. So it could well be that when Moses approaches Pharaoh and says, I want time off for my people to worship their God, we want a couple days, the response is, he's not on my list of gods, sorry, you don't get a day off. But these sort of work rosters do help flesh out. And by the way, we also have other documents that show that the pharaohs and the supervisors did impose quotas even on Egyptian workers, not just the foreign POWs who were forced to work, all the workers had to meet certain quotas. And often, more often than not, they didn't meet them. So that fits very nicely. In terms of agriculture, we can see from scenes like these, especially in the grape vineyards, that most of the workers here, just a little closer look, these workers are, you can see there's a very dark-skinned black African. Here you can see a light-haired person. Again, that's not an Egyptian. The workers doing a lot of the agriculture work in these scenes are also non-Egyptians who were brought in for purposes of forced labor. So we explicitly find these foreign workers working in the very two areas the Bible has the Israelites working: brickmaking and building, and agriculture. Okay, just some of the arrows pointing to some of these guys. Okay. And we actually have some scenes like this one where the POWs are actually being marched into Egypt. And you can see here the stick-wielding taskmasters, nudging them along and get going here. And so there's ample evidence that during the period when we believe Moses and the Israelites would have been in Egypt, and I would put that anywhere between 1500 and 1300 BC, is a time when we have all these prisoners of war coming into Egypt. By the way, in Exodus 12:38, we are told that when the Israelites left, when they finally were given their permission to leave, that we're told a mixed multitude also went with them. The mixed multitude is never fleshed out, but most commentators believe, and I believe, that this is a reference to people who said, we were dragged into Egypt, we see what your God has done here, and we're going to leave with you. And they took off. I suspect some of the kinds of people we saw in these scenes said, we're out of here too. And they took advantage of this exodus. This is one more scene showing the stomping on grapes, making grape juice for wine. Again, the workers are non-Egyptian. All right, so what we see is a pretty good picture of what the Bible is talking about as something that we can actually match with archaeological evidence from Egypt. I want to focus a little on the geography. Geography is important. It's very simple. Have you ever had an archaeologist here talking about the excavations at Modor or the Shire? Has anybody found the two towers, the twin towers? The archaeology of the geography of Lewis and Tolkien? No, we read that, we know it. It has no ring of reality. There are no archaeologists out there trying to prove those mythological worlds. Some people are trying to argue this today, that the geography presented in the book of Exodus is not a realistic geography that reflects anything on an ancient map. I'd like to argue that it's very appropriate and very fitting. I don't have time to get into all the geography. That's the sort of thing I do in my book. It's really boring stuff, but you might like it. I do want to focus on the building of Ramesses. I wish I had time for Pithom, but the exciting news is this site is actually being excavated properly for the first time there were brief excavations in 1970 at this site called Tel Rataba, and the previous excavations go back to 1910. So good work has not been done for a long time, and I've just been in touch with the Polish director about his work. We've been communicating for some time, but they're doing good work. So maybe if I come back at some point in the future, we'll have something more on Pithom. But in any event, now with reference to Ramesses, we have actually 5 occurrences of it in 4 different passages: Genesis, Exodus, twice in Exodus, and also in Numbers 2 times. Now, the word Ramesses occurs only here in the Bible, and it occurs in chapter 1 of verse 11 of Exodus in reference to the buildings that the Israelites are helping to make. In Exodus 12:37 and the 2 Numbers references, it's the launching point for the Exodus. That's where they leave from to start the departure. So that's very important because it gives us a reference point that we can look for. Is there such a place is there a dot we can put on our map to start our MapQuest search for the Promised Land. Okay, so the obvious question is, was there a city in what the Bible calls the land of Goshen, the northeastern delta of Egypt, called Ramses? And the answer is yes. This was long known. In fact, the city was actually built by Ramses II. Remember, he lived long enough to build a city. And it was actually called Pi-Ramesses, which means the house of Ramses. And it flourished between about 1270 and by 1070, 200 years later, it was abandoned and the city dismantled, which is why it took such a long time for Egyptologists to find it. The ancient Egyptians were probably the original recyclers. They simply reused blocks. And the blocks they removed, we now know this, they removed it from the ancient city of Ramses, moved it north 12 miles, and built a new city called Tanis. And, you know, in Raiders of the Lost Ark? You know that movie? Okay, I just want to make sure. In that movie, there's this French archaeologist who the Nazis try to compel to help them find the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the reality was the French did start digging at Tanis in 1928, and they're still digging. They've done a lot of work. There's still a lot more work to do. But for about 30 years, they thought they had found Ramses because it had all these blocks with Ramses' name on, and it fooled them. But we'll get back to that in a moment. In its place, as I said, a new city was built out of the ruins of Ramesses, 12 miles to the north, and that city the Bible calls Zoan, Z-O-A-N, Zoan in Hebrew. In Greek, so depending on your translation, it might come off as Tanis. It depends on your translation. So Tanis is simply the Greek vocalization of Hebrew, Zoan. And this city flourished from 1070 all the way down to AD Roman times. Very long history. Now what's interesting is to look at where Zoan or Tanis is used in the Bible, and we find it all in the later periods. In Isaiah, we find it in Ezekiel 30, and perhaps the most perplexing is in Psalm 78. When the psalmist recalls God's miraculous deeds done in Egypt, he talks about this happening in the fields of Zoan, the fields of Zoan or Tanis. Now that's interesting because when the psalmist is writing, the city of Ramses didn't exist. It had been gone for about 500 or 400 years. So instead of naming the city that's now gone, he named the current city, which was within the basic neighborhood. So it's worth noting that the city of Ramses is never mentioned once you get out of the Pentateuch, out of the books, the 5 books of Moses, when the city didn't exist. So that's to me is a very compelling point. Now, as I say, finding it was difficult. All these dots on the map remember different areas where people thought Ramses was over the decades. And as I say, the French were digging Tanis starting in the 1920s when Indiana Jones was there, and they're still working there to this day, but it was not till the 1980s that they finally realized and admitted they didn't have Tanis. Now, I think about it, it's really something for a French to admit they were wrong about anything. But it was actually found, as they say, at a site known by its Arabic modern name, Kantir. Kantir was actually found by and identified by a Coptic Christian Egyptologist named Labib Habashi in the 1950s, and nobody believed him. Of course the French were right, the Egyptians were wrong, right? Napoleon won. Anyway, if you go to the fields of Ramses today, you'll still see fragments of statues laying around the fields, as you see here. This is the feet of the statue. That's my daughter. As you can see, she has big feet to fill. In the wheat fields of Egypt. But this led Habashi to begin looking around, doing a little prodding, and he was the first to actually propose that in the fields of Kantir is where ancient Ramesses was located. German archaeologists have been working there off and on for the past 30 years, and work is going to resume again one of these days. But here are some of the blocks they have found. Here's a picture of Ramses wielding his sword, defeating his enemies on a pillar, and the colored door lintel with the name of Ramses II on it. One of the most exciting finds was they actually found the stables, the main stables of the chariotry. And what you're looking at, now you're all Texans, so I probably don't need to explain this, these are hitching posts. These are posts set in the ground where you'd tie up your horses through those holes. And you can actually see rope marks where the stone was actually rubbed by the rope. But Edgar Pusch estimated that the stable there at Ramses could have held up to 500 horses or outfitted 250 chariots. So there's a sizable chariotry based there in the capital. Today, wonderful work is being done using magnetometry, not the little kind you go around looking for coins in the park, but this is more sophisticated tools which is integrated into a software program that allows you to reconstruct with coordinates and lay on a map. And wonderful results come from these that allow us to see where buildings were. Look at this. Here's a picture of what turns out to be a palace. By simply looking at the architectural plan, we know this was a palace. In fact, if you look carefully, you see there's sort of a shadow, and there's actually two phases of construction there on two different orientations. So one of the tools we have available to us, again, these are wheat fields and cornfields today. There's no blocks sticking up, but they're able to do this magnetometer survey, and now they know exactly where things are. But based on the surveys that Edgar Pusch did at Ramesses, he estimates that the ancient city was 10 square kilometers, making it the largest city known in the ancient world. So to do all that building, one might think, yes, we need all the help we can get. So we have a dot we can put on a map now. It took Egyptologists 100 years to find this one. This was the easiest one to find. So in Exodus 13:7, we're told which way the Israelites did not go when they left Egypt. Now, this passage is a puzzling one, but I think work that's been going on in Egypt and to which we made some contributions in the past decade, work that began in the 1980s, has completely changed our understanding of this area. In any event, let's just read this verse. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the land of the Philistines, although it was near, for God said, lest they turn back. It's a very important word in Hebrew, shuv. Okay? Just shuv it. That's the word. Don't forget it. Shuv. It'll come back later. We'll need it. By the way, this is the word the prophets use for repent. To turn away. You're heading down a certain path, immorality, idolatry. You're supposed to shuv. You're supposed to turn and come back the opposite direction. That's the word. Okay, so turn back. When they see war and return to Egypt, what was out there on this road that would scare the bejeebers out of the Hebrews and make them want to go back to Pharaoh? Now we know. Now, there were two routes in and out of Egypt. The Bible mentions them both by name. We have the way of the land of the Philistines, the northern one that hugs the coast. And then there's a more southerly route that the Bible calls the way of Shur. Okay, the way of Shur figures prominently in the book of Genesis. Remember, Hagar, when she flees from Sarah, is on the way of Shur, heading back to Egypt. Okay, and that's because they were in Beersheba. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, there. They were in Beersheba right here, so this is not the road she would take to go back to Egypt. Okay, so there are two ways in and out of Egypt to get to Canaan. And what we're told is that God says, don't go that northern way because you're going to see war and you're going to turn back. What was out there? What was lurking? Really, until recently, all we knew about this area was what we have from this temple. This is the Great Karnak Temple in southern Egypt. And on the outside wall, marked in white there, is a very famous battle scene. And this is Seti I. Seti I is the father of Ramses, the great Ramses II. We see him returning with prisoners from a military campaign. And the drawing, the illustration, the actual scene is rather hard to read these days. And you'll notice that a whole section of it is lost. Now, thankfully, and this is why scholars do the work they do, thanks to the epigraphic work, the copying of these texts by hand drawing, exact facsimile, made 200 years ago even though today it's gone, we know what's there. And it turns out to be extremely important. Because what we have is a series of buildings, which you can see right here, and then you have these series of forts, and I'm only showing you one of actually 3 panels, which shows this way of the land of the Philistines, which the Egyptians called the ways of Horus. Horus is the sky god. And Pharaoh is associated with the god Horus. He's called the son of Re, who is Horus, the living Horus, the Pharaoh is called. So here you have these buildings, and by the way, they look very small, but they are actually forts. Of course, Pharaoh has to be bigger than life, as we talked about in chapel today. Pharaoh is the most powerful man in the world, so even forts look tiny compared to Pharaoh. But what we see here, and this is fantastic, we have 2 sets of buildings. You can see them here. And one of them is actually named, where you see the letter B, if you can see that way up on the screen, there's actually a name written in hieroglyphs, and it's called in Egyptian, it's called Chetem en Charu, the fortress of Charu. This was Egypt's official entry point. This is, if you were coming to Egypt, you had to check here. That's why I call it Checkpoint Charu. Some of you people might know. Okay, some people are old enough to know about that. This was the official entry point. In fact, the word Chetem, which we translate fort, really means seal. This is where you get your documents sealed or stamped, your passports when you came into Egypt. So we know that we have these series of buildings. We know that there was some sort of waterway, and between these 2 buildings complexes, there was some sort of bridge. And then we have a series of forts that continue to go off this scene and onto the next 2 panels, which I don't have time to show you. But they end up, the last one is in Gaza. And the name Gaza, which we still hear about in this day, that was known in the 15th century, 13th century Egypt. So this was the official entry point into Canaan if you're coming from Egypt. Same name, survived all these years. Okay? So we know where this route is. It goes across North Sinai and ends up in the land of Canaan. Now I want to take notice. We have the name of the first fort. It's called the Fortress Charu. And what's always puzzling is there were 2 buildings and this waterway in between. Then there's a fort called the Dwelling of the Lion, and it's very hard to judge. In fact, you can't judge scale and distance on these things. And then right after the horse's hooves is a small fort, but look, the name here, I want you to remember this because we'll come back to it later. It's called the Migdal of Seti I. That's the name of the pharaoh. That's this little fort right here. It's called the Migdal of Seti I. So we'll come back to this. There it is. Okay. Now what you're looking at is a declassified CIA Corona satellite image from the 1960s used by the CIA to help the Israelis and help the Egyptians keep peace. And we can send you pictures. We know what you're doing with your tanks. We know where you're putting your missiles. So all this was to keep people in track. But the importance of it is that in the last 15 years, there's been so much development. Agriculture, building, urbanization, even in Sinai, that we can't actually see what the ground looked like today, the way it does at this date in the 1960s. But what we've learned from this, and by on-ground geological work, is that we now know that this line that you see here, it's actually the ancient coastline. The Mediterranean was all out here on the top of this picture. In fact, today, by the way, for those of you who, this dark patch you see going down the side is the edge of the Suez Canal. So if you want to go to where the Mediterranean is today, you have to go about 30 miles north. So going back 3,000 and more, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, the Mediterranean was right here, and this was the coastline. So the first thing we realized when we got out there and started our work is if we want to try to find anything having to do with the route of the Exodus and where the Egyptians had their forts and where the Hebrews shouldn't go and so on, it became important to reconstruct what things were like 3,500 years ago, not what maps look like today. Very often, amateur biblical wannabe scholars start with modern day maps and they try to put dots and move things around and just think you can do whatever you want. you have no certainty until you do the geological work where these things actually were. And so this has really enhanced our knowledge considerably. But maybe you can see it if you're close enough, that in that white circle is a rectangular feature. That rectangular feature is an archaeological site called Hebwa. It's Arabic name, Hebwa and 1. And then across the way is another site which has been dubbed Hebwa 2. Now, this picture is from our excavations, just a little bit south of here. And one of the things we discovered, much to our surprise, here we're digging in the sand. We're out in the desert, right? And we're digging along, and suddenly, maybe you can just see it here, but right where that arrow is shooting across, suddenly, after 2 feet of digging pure yellow sand, the ground turns black. And at that point, I realized we're out of archaeological stuff, and my buddy, Dr. Stephen Mosier, a geologist from Wheaton College, jumps in, and we turn it over to the geologist. You figured this stuff out. This is no longer archaeologist geology. Look at that. What we have was a branch of the Nile that flowed right through our site. By studying the shells and by studying the sediments, and Dr. Mosier was in touch with Jean Daniel Stanley from the Smithsonian, who's been doing work in the Delta of Egypt for many years, and we collaborated with him, and he's completely affirms what we said. We had a funny thing happen when Dr. Mosier wrote up his article to submit it to the journal Geoarchaeology. He got a very complimentary, blind refereed report back, and the thing was published. We happened to see Dr. Stanley a couple months later, and Dr. Mosier says, "You were the referee for that article, weren't you?" He says, "Yeah, I was. Good work." So it was very affirming what we were doing. Anyway, with the work Dr. Mosier has done and other geologists, we can now reconstruct this area to look like what you see here. The blue area on the top represents where one branch of the Nile comes out and empties into a large lagoon that's about 5 miles long and about 4 miles wide. The green patch you see has another branch of the Nile going through it, and during flood season it would widen out into a marshy wetlands, actually a lake. And this is the branch of the Nile that we actually discovered right by the site we're digging, called Tel El Borg. Okay, for these on this side, right over here. So what we see is something that looks very different than if you were there on the ground today just looking around. It's altogether different. We now know. Don't you love when scholars say that? How do you know? Okay, that's what the lawyer asks. How do you know? We actually know that there was a road right on this dotted line. I've actually seen it. I've walked on it. Of crushed limestone. It was paved. Why was it paved? You can't drive chariots in sand. You have to have some sort of paving. And we found several segments of roads so the Egyptians can move chariots around. So what we do now know, when we combine the archaeology and the geology, we have the Mediterranean. Let me back up just a second. We have the Mediterranean up to the north. We have the road coming out here, and what we have is water on one side. We have a Nile branch right here, and you'll see in a moment that site Hebwa turns out to be a huge fort. Here are the walls of the fort that were discovered beginning in about 1985-86. It may not look all that imposing. The walls are about 12 feet wide, and you can see the turrets. This is a line drawing showing it. So this wall, it hasn't been fully excavated, but it's so close to the surface you can just go with a brush, sweep off the sand, and there's the mud bricks. Now, this is a wall that one time would have stood 30-some feet high, and we're down to the final 2 feet of it, or less. That wall, because Dr. Maksud, the director there, has gone up the road, swept off the dust, the sand, and now we know this wall measures 800 yards long, over 800 meters by 400 meters. So we now know that if you're going out of Egypt, you would have water on one side of it, you'd have a river and wetlands on the other, and you have this fort sitting out in front of you. Now, we know this is the ancient site of Charu because in 1999, Again, one of those providential things. The day I showed up to begin our survey, this statue was found. And the statue has on it an inscription which reads, and Dr. Maksud, who is shown there, and I had the privilege of reading this, the first people to read this in 3,200 years. It's an offering statue dedicated to the god Horus, Lord of Charu, the name of this area. Then in 2005, another cache of statues was found, and this statue also had the name of the site Charu on it. When you find two inscriptions with the name of a site at your tell where you're excavating, I mean, that's an archaeologist's delight, right, Dr. Long? You find that, I mean, that makes your career. So we can actually put a dot on the map again. So there is Hebel 1. Now, in 2007, work began in earnest on the other side, and by the way, maybe if you can see, you can actually see there's a white thin line going there. You can actually see traces of an ancient river that's now dried out. So we can see the water ran through and emptied into this lagoon out here. So work began in 2007. And by the way, that little star is the site Tel El Borg where we excavated. It's only about 3 kilometers. I'm sorry, I can't always translate this back into miles, but it's a little, just under 2 miles between Tel El Borg, the fort we excavated, and the next fort that, and look at the walls on this baby. These are 34-foot thick walls. That's a man standing up there, okay? The reason these walls are so much thicker is because if an invasion came to Egypt, they would hit this fort first, have to cross the water, and then they have the second fort. So this is the one that would take the brunt of an invasion. So this fort is still being excavated, and I have this is an aerial shot, a balloon shot, and I want you to take a notice the difference between 2007 and 2 years later. This up here at the top is where the gate area is that has, for reasons that remain baffling to me, the archaeologist Dr. Maksud has not excavated the gate. The gate's always the most important, most fun area, but he, for some reason, hasn't. Inside of it, there is another walls of an earlier fort, which was later transformed into being the temple complex. This fort is smaller in terms of size. It's about 500 meters long and 250 wide. But it's got these 34-foot thick walls. And you can see the little fort inside of it. That's the earlier fort, this is the later fort. So if you want the Exodus to be in the 15th century, that's your fort, at least part of it. If you want it to be in the 13th century, that's the fort. So there's a fort here no matter where you want to put the Exodus. So everybody can be happy. This is a recent balloon shot. And this is now the area I just showed you, but it has a tripartite temple. And that's where those, they found all kinds of statues and inscriptions and so on. And there's the gate area still unexcavated, but they focused on this area. So, and notice here, there are those long storerooms like we saw down in southern Egypt, but the vaults are gone. They're just melted. So massive fort. This is huge. Okay, so now that we can follow the forts, we can actually outline, when we combine the archaeological with the geological, the actual way of the land of the Philistines, this road that the Israelites did not take, and it's a connect the dots. Follow the forts. It had to go around the lagoon, and it would have gone off into the land of Canaan. But you can see now how treacherous this area would have been. To come out this area with the Mediterranean on one side, the Nile branch on the other, with all kinds of marshy wetlands, and this huge fort followed by another fort, followed by another fort, you could understand why God says, I think there's a better way out of Egypt. Let's try that route. Okay, so let's try that route. Okay, this is just putting this all together. We can now identify the actual forts. And by the way, there are people who wanted to take these illustrations and say, well, they're just artistic. They shouldn't be taken literally. And voila, we now have the fort sitting right where the scene shows it, with water going down the middle, just as we have found it to be. So that's the road not traveled. Let's look at the road traveled and try to move along here quickly. So the Israelites traveled, we're told, from Ramesses to Sukkot, which means they headed off in a southerly direction. We have 3 references to that, Exodus and 2 in Numbers. And so we know that they're heading off towards the south. Why? They're trying to head towards the other way out of Egypt. And the reason we can identify Succoth is because we actually have a site, the name of which survives in Arabic as Tel al-Maskuta. Maskuta is the Arabic name that preserves, you can actually see the word Sukkot in the surviving Arabic name. So the name Sukkot is actually the Hebrew writing for the ancient Egyptian name for this area. And this inscription was found many years ago by Petrie in his excavations in that very area. And what you see is Ramses II smiting the head of a foreigner and standing in front of the god who is called Amun, the lord of Succoth or Cheku. So the name is no question. So once they get to this point, they travel towards the very edge of the wilderness. They're about to cross into Egypt, and then get this very peculiar message. And God says, tell the Israelites to, there's that word again, turn back. So initially, they didn't want to go out the one way because he was afraid they would turn back. Now they're going out a different way, and God says, turn back. Okay? And head towards Pihahirot, Migdal, Baal Zephon. I wish I had time to unpackage all that. I don't. But basically, we see them turning back up to the area they originally were trying to avoid. As an archaeologist, looking at it from a geographical standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of good sense. But boy, does it make good sermons. One of the reasons I'm so certain about this now is because since, and by the way, you can see this is that area again. I'm going to take you to the site I excavated for almost a decade, 1999 to 2008, Tel el-Borg, because simply put, now that we know that these 2 forts together make up the Charu fortress complex, Egypt's frontier town, we have the next fort is called the Dwelling of the Lion, which we believe this is our site, Tel el-Borg. And then we're told on the Seti relief that the 3rd fort in the sequence is called the Migdal of Seti Merneptah, the name of the king. The term Migdal is the term we have in Exodus 14:2. This is not a frequently occurring word in Egyptian. In fact, Dr. Ellen Morris of Columbia University wrote a 900-page doctoral dissertation on the forts of Egypt, both in the north and in the south. And she concluded, and I think she's right, that there is only one possible fort called Migdal in Pharaonic times, or in New Kingdom times, the period of the Exodus. And it's located in North Sinai in this sequence of forts. Very interesting. So let me take you to Tel el-Borg briefly. This is what the site looks like today. There are canals running through it, roads running through it. Here's our site map with the canal. I want to take you to the fort we discovered. What we discovered, very exciting, was the remains of a moat that surrounded a fort of the 15th and 14th centuries. There you're looking at it. This is all the subsurface material. The wall above it is completely gone, completely eroded. If they hadn't built a moat here, we would have never known there was a fort because the walls are all gone. A combination of wind, rain, etc. Okay, here's just another look at the side, well-preserved section of it. The steep walls, our workers have to rappel to go up and down to clean it. Should I tell them about Dwayne, Mark? Or should I just skip over this? Okay, we're running low on time. But anyway, you got to love this story. We had a guy named Dwayne, graduate student, MA Archaeology student, first dig from Tennessee. Won't hold that against him. My daughter lives there. We know after all our experience digging the moats that they just are basically filled with wind-blown sand. So we sent Dwayne, he's a big strapping football player kind of guy, where he could do no harm. Because Dwayne, go over there, see all that sand? Take your wheelbarrow, take your shovel, and start filling your wheelbarrow, emptying the moat. By the way, you can see the edge of the top of the wall of the moat right here, right? See that? There's the other side right there. So we're digging these nice, neat squares. Send Dwayne over, he can do no damage. That's always what you do to first-year students. And right in there, so take your wheelbarrow, and he goes over, shovel, throws his sand in, clunk. He looks in his wheelbarrow, and he struck gold. 34 pieces of silver, 34 pieces of gold, now safely, in the Cairo Museum. All right, so he's very proud of his find. And the earrings, all our women on our staff wanted to try out. But anyway, by the way, when you see those earrings, remember that when the Hebrew women left Egypt, those golden earrings got them in trouble, didn't it? Yeah, that's what you're looking at. Those are gold earrings from this time period. All right, so we have two forts, Red Fort by the red brick wall, and then we have a second fort off to the right. I wish I could tell you more about it, but look how much of this wall, a 30-some foot wall, is now down to the final brick. That's all that survived. So it's pretty amazing when you think about how little has survived because of the environmental conditions of northern Egypt. Was the gate area. We can reconstruct things thanks to the foundation trenches for the gate area. There were two towers, a couple pieces of stone left lying around. We have broken fragments of limestone. And enough of these have inscriptions on. We can jigsaw puzzle them together. You like jigsaw puzzles? I got work for you. All you have to do is be able to read hieroglyphs. But we have enough to know that this stone wall of this fort was made by Ramses II. We also have some fragments with his son Merneptah. So based on the bits and pieces we have, our architect was able to reconstruct the fort gate as follows. Now, very quickly, we also found in the second fort, it also had a moat, but it was very different from the red brick moat you saw. And in the middle of this moat, which was rather short-lived, we actually found the remains of 4 equines. We call them equines because we think 2 of them may be horses, 1 a mule, and 1 a donkey. But it's very hard to do the bone work, and because they were in very bad condition, we looked very carefully to see if there's any evidence that they had drowned. But just kidding, couldn't do that. Nearby, we found these bridle bits for the horse's bridle, and this little piece was rather fun. I finally figured out what this was sitting in my office, not actually looking at the piece, but this is a knob that would sit on top of a chariot yoke. These were actually found intact in King Tut's tomb. So this is one of King Tut's chariot yokes from his chariots. So it's basically that little knob up there. Then the last thing we found connected to horses and chariots is this little stela, and you see 2 gods, deities. A god on the left is Reshef, and the goddess on the right is Astarte, a.k.a. Annie Oakley, riding around sitting on the back of a chair on her horse. Is that the way ladies ride down here? Anyway, but what's so interesting about this is that the god, Reshef, is said to be the lord of the chariot stables. So all the bits and pieces we found, literally the bits and the pieces, and the horse remains, show us that there were chariots located at these forts. So it's now changing my image. I used to think of, okay, Ramses or Thutmose or whoever is dispatching the chariotry from the delta and they're chasing the Israelites. Now we know there were forts ringing around that whole area. You could have all kinds of chariots coming from every direction after the Israelites at this point. One last thing on this. The person to whom the little inscription is dedicated, the overseer of horses, himself has a foreign name. And Professor Kitchen and I published this inscription together. So where is Migdol? Because Migdol is the key site. If we can find Migdol, we have found the location of the sea. Because the sea they crossed, we're told, is beside Migdol. Now there's only one fort called Migdol that we know from Egyptian records. And by the way, it's the same area when Jeremiah arrives in Egypt, and he arrives at a fort called Migdol. Well, a site called Migdol. Ezekiel refers to Migdol. So we know that the border of Egypt, in this area, there was a site that goes way back called Migdol. So the names stayed the same, even though the fort location has moved. I don't have time to get into that, but it's now pretty clear that all these forts were built in the same area and the names stayed the same over time. The reason the fort kept on moving is because as the environment changed. As the lakes dried up, as the rivers moved, they had to keep adjusting their defenses to accommodate the new realities. But the name stayed the same. Now, this fort was still standing in the days of Ramses III in the early 12th century. We have this depiction of a fort. And so, now, let me move. I'm going to try to move this along a little quicker. I'm sorry. This is all very good stuff, but I'm just showing you how we can actually identify sites based on using these satellite images. All these dark spots that you see on this map are archaeological sites in circles. At the very southern tip of the lagoon, right down here, there's a dark spot. You see that? Now, our site here has no dark spot, but there it was. Here's the two Hebwa sites, and down here, I believe, is where ancient Migdol was located, the very southern tip of the lagoon. Again, these are 1960 images, and you can actually see, we'll zoom in closer, there are some, there's a rectangular structure there. Today, it's a banana orchard. We've tried to go in there, look around, you cannot see a thing anymore. It's changed that rapidly since the 1960s, but there clearly is a site there. So here's my proposed reconstruction then. Based on the geology, the archaeology, and so on, that the Israelites were initially avoiding getting out of Egypt coming this way, but God sends them around this way, and probably somewhere in here we have the sea crossing. Now, I'm going to skip this very quickly and go to my conclusion. Okay. In Exodus 10:19, we have the wonderful verse about how God removed the locusts that had swarmed Egypt in connection with the plagues. I'm giving you the New Jerusalem Bible translation for two reasons. Number one, it translates the name of the sea as the Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea. That's another lecture topic. But Yahweh changed the wind into a west wind, very strong, which carried the locusts away and swept them into the Sea of Reeds. Now, this is one of the plagues, blowing the locusts into the sea. Now, you know elsewhere in the Bible, like Amos and Joel, locusts are referred to as my army. They're symbolic of invading armies. So here you have a literal locust swarm being blown into the sea east of where the Israelites are in Egypt. By the way, I think that's all meant to be a foreshadowing of the Egyptian army that will soon be joining the locusts in the sea. Now, here's a map of the area. Here's the area of Ramesses. And so we have the Israelites living here in the land of Goshen. And so if we have the wind blowing east, you see where the locusts are going to head, right towards this large Balach lake system, the very northern end of which I showed you, the extensions of which we now know go further north than when this map was made some years ago. So you can see that very clearly, I think. If you go there today, the lake is all but gone. There's nothing left except for a few patches. And where there is a little water, here's Dr. Mosier, my geologist buddy, and we're amazed by these reeds, how tall they grow, even where there's little water in this area today. So it's not surprising that the Egyptians would have called this the Sea of Reeds, and why it's simply descriptive of what this area would have looked like. And you can imagine, if it had been lots of water, what that would have looked like. I want to do one last thing, and then we'll bring this to the end. Invariably, when I do this talk, the first question that comes is, how deep was it? Right? That doesn't look like a very impressive place for God to deliver the Israelites, right? Okay, so we did a little survey work, and by the way, the work is still ongoing. Dr. Mosier would be in Egypt now working on this if he wasn't such a big chicken and afraid to go to Egypt. But anyway, I don't know why, but anyway, we found the very edge of this ancient lake, and all these dots on this picture here represent areas where we actually did augering, going down 20 plus feet to understand subsurface what's going on. And here is the very edge, and I know this to be true because my son carried the survey rod all the way out 320 meters when they sighted it, and the amount of drop from the edge of the lake to 320 meters was a 6-meter drop, or about 18, 19 feet. So this lake was not a puddle. It could have been anywhere from 15 to 18 feet deep, and for my money, you could drown a lot of horses in that amount of water. So anyway, the work is still ongoing. Dr. Mosier is actually on sabbatical. He's working with new satellite images, and he's going to be collaborating with some French scholars. We're still trying to reconstruct the history of this area. But hopefully you see the importance of not only the archaeology, but the geology. It not only helps authenticate, I believe, the story and the details, but it also helps provide some new angles for sermon material. Thank you very much.
In lieu of Q&A from the audience, I've been told to divine what your questions are and to ask them. I've been trying, and I don't get but like a lot of voices all at one time, and I'm having trouble picking them out, so I got a few of my own questions. As I consider this, and I've heard this lecture, I've read his books and all the rest, I approach this as a lawyer, and I want to make sure I understand a couple of things that you're saying right, and if I do, that our friends out there do as well.
I'd like to understand them too.
Okay. If you take the skeptics, the Israel Finkelsteins, Silberman, those folks who put out, and by the way, they're not the only ones on the Discovery Channel and Nat Geo. Jim's been on those channels as well. He's on TV all the time also. But if you take what those men are saying, they're saying the Exodus was concocted by Israelites who wanted to give some meaning to some made-up national heritage somewhere in the 600 BC range. Is that fair?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. If you take the Exodus story that you gave us, where God says, don't go the way of the Philistines, that northern route, lest you run in and see war and turn around and shove back to Egypt. Mm-hmm. Those forts, when were they forts? In other words, how was that valid? Would an Israelite writing in 600 BC even know about the way of the Philistines and the forts that are there that you've been showing us?
Well, the picture had changed considerably because the terrain had changed. There were still forts out there at later time. But as best we can tell, not in the same numbers. So the terrain had changed, and the whole network of forts were changed too. But there were fewer in number. It was not nearly as formidable as in the 15th through 13th century.
All right. My same question would be for the city of Ramesses, Pi Ramesses. Do you say Pi or P? Ramesses.
Yes.
Either one.
P.
All right. P Ramesses. The house of Ramesses, we'll put it into English. The house of Ramesses that is clearly written about in the Exodus story and in the writings that we equate with Moses. How long was that a city before it was destroyed and recycled and moved upstream?
Well, what happened is that in the course of about 120 years, the Nile branch, basically Egypt is connected to what makes Egypt live, of course, is the Nile. And the major cities are built along the course of the Nile. In 120 years, the Nile had meandered and begun to desiccate. And so the city was basically isolated from connection to the rest of Egypt. So Kitchen says that by 1130 BC is the last datable pharaoh whose inscriptions we have from Pi-Ramesses. So the royal family may have actually left by 1130. So you're talking about less than 150 years. By 1070, the new city had been built out of its remains. So that's why I think that's a significant datum, because a person writing in the 6th century, and by the way, they've tried to get around this by saying, well, since the blocks came from Pi-Ramesses, that some of the cults, some of the gods in Tanis were actually called the gods of Ramesses. Sorry. But as I've pointed out, and by the way, Kenneth Kitchen points out, and I think we're right, surely the Israelites in the 6th century are not naming the city after little chapels to gods. After all, chapels were off limits to Egyptians, let alone foreigners. So I don't think you had some Israelite priest coming to Egypt saying, by the way, we're doing some background research on a story we're writing about our ancestors. I think that the reference to Ramses is very vital.
Okay, so to put it in our terms, that would be like one of us, even though we have internet resources, we have schooling, we have education, we have many academic advantages over the Israelites of 600 BC. But the idea that one of us could write a narrative account that accounts for geography and towns that haven't even existed in the last 600 years, since, say, since before Columbus hit America, we're going to cite the ancient names of these towns and these roadways. Is that some of the compelling evidence you have that is consistent with the narrative of the Exodus?
Right. Yes, and if time had allowed, and I could have gone through every one of the names that we have in the Exodus narrative there, all the geographical terms, every one of them I can document in the 13th century BC. The term Sukkoth or Cheku we have going back to the 15th century BC. And some of them do survive into later times. So in academic, for sake of academic integrity, I would say that yes, you can argue that these names do survive in some cases to the later time, but you could argue just as well they are all there at an earlier time. But I think because those scholars have a predisposition towards late dating everything. And by the way, I think their reasoning is pretty clear. This is their thinking. If we can late date the story, then the credibility of the story dwindles. And so I think there is an agenda, just as much as I'm at least willing to admit my agenda is that I believe we are dealing with authentic history. We're dealing with real places that survived for hundreds of years in some cases. And so I admit my bias. They claim not to have any. And that's, of course, not.
All right, I want to take your ideas and I want to go backwards with them. One of the things that I think many of us remember about the Exodus story is before the Exodus, of course, Joseph arrives into Egypt. And other than a little bit of time spent in prison, and as a lawyer, that's not that big a deal. Other than, he just needed better lawyers. Other than a little bit of time, say habla español. Other than a little bit of time spent in prison, Joseph gets a good reception. He rises up, according to the biblical account, to be Pharaoh's right-hand man. His brothers and his father and his family get a hero's reception by Pharaoh. They're set up in fertile ground. They're allowed to prosper and thrive. But somewhere after that, the passage in Genesis says, there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And that's when the slavery and the persecution starts.
Right.
If you take your time of Ramesses and you go back 400 years and you look at the time when Joseph first came, was there anything that happened in Egyptian history that would explain why Joseph got a friendly reception with his family, but somewhere after that, things changed?
Yeah. Well, my belief is that in the period roughly between 1650, 1675, down to about 1550. There's about 100, 125 years where Egypt, at least the northern half of Egypt, was controlled by foreigners. You may know them from literature as the Hyksos. The Hyksos is a name that survives in Josephus. Josephus, actually, the Jewish historian, quotes an older Egyptian priest historian named Manetho, and he says, I'm quoting him as if he were in the witness box. And he quotes Manetho, who describes these people, these foreigners who came to Egypt, invaded and controlled Egypt. Now we know that that word Hyksos really means Egyptian Heka Chasut, foreign rulers. These were foreign rulers. Professor Manfred Bietak from the University of Vienna for the past 40 years has been digging up the Hyksos capital just south of Pyramesses, the site we were talking about tonight. He has found the Hyksos palace, their tombs, their architecture, their pottery is different. They were clearly foreigners. In the course of 100 plus years, they became somewhat bicultural. They actually wrote in hieroglyphs. Their kings wrote their name in cartouches like pharaohs, but they had foreign names. So they were Egyptianized foreigners. And so people like Professor Kitchen and I and others believe that during the time when you had these foreign rulers would have been the time that Jacob would have been welcomed to Egypt, at a time when Joseph could have been elevated to a position of high status. And then around 1525 BC, these foreign rulers were booted out by kings from the south, from Thebes, where you saw the mud brick vaulted chambers. A series of war over 25 years, and now the people from the south took over and knocked out these foreign rulers. Immediately they set about to an energetic building program, building fortresses, new palaces, and for the next about a century, there were massive building projects, and Bietak has found these palaces. They're huge.
And by the way, Bietak is no flaming evangelical Christian, is he?
No, not at all. And a couple of years ago when we were visiting him, we had an interesting experience. Sorry about that. We were visiting him, and this goes back 7, 8 years ago. But I asked him, I said, now you've been working, at this time, he'd worked there for 35 years. He had been working 2 seasons a year. That's usually a 6 to 8 week season is what we do. He did 2 a year for 35 years. That's 70 seasons of work. And I said, Manfred, could you tell me, what percentage of ancient Avaris do you believe you've uncovered? And he said 3%. And of course we have to say, well, no wonder we don't have a lot of information if it takes that much time and that much work. And we have 3%, and what percent of that 3% represents what actually survived? So we really have limited amount of information. But we do the best we can. But we do know they were foreigners and that they dominated Egypt, and then everything changed when the native Egyptians took over. And that's when the hostility began, I believe, towards the Hebrews.
All right, so if you work back from the chronology, you have leaders or Pharaoh in northern Egypt, where the Israelites were settled, who were foreigners. Do we know if they were foreigners in the sense of Semitic, like
Yes.
the Israelites?
Yes, because we have some of their names.
Okay.
Some of their names, and they are Semitic. Their material culture is Canaanite. Professor Bietak happens to think they're northern Canaanite. Professor Larry Steger sees a lot of connections with southern Canaanites, so it might have been a bit of both, but they were clearly Canaanite.
From the land where Joseph would have come from.
That's correct.
And so it makes sense that Joseph would have fit right in. And then at some point the southern pharaohs conquered the northern pharaohs, and that's when the enslavement would have begun. That's when the building programs and all of the names and the chronology and the geography fit. Is that fair?
That's my contention.
All right. Last question. If you could snap your fingers and get... No. Let me add... Different last question. Sorry, I got distracted by that lady back there. She was sending me one. You said that we don't have in that environment any evidence of Hebrews. By the same token, no evidence of anybody, because all of the papyrus has been destroyed and rotted away. Fair?
Fair.
Even if the Egyptians had kept records based upon all of your study as an Egyptologist, how consistently did they do these magnificent stone carvings where they extolled the virtues of their enemies who defeated them?
0. No, that of course is one of the problems. The Egyptians were notorious for their propagandistic use of these artistic images we've been looking at. So Pharaoh always wins. I mean, that's why I think the plagues lasted so long. They couldn't believe Pharaoh couldn't pull this off. He couldn't somehow defeat Moses and his God. So, yeah, they didn't. So there may have been archival evidence, like, you know, a message to the border forts, dispatch your chariots, round up Hebrews kind of thing. But they're not going to go carve on the front of a temple saying, great defeat, Ammon lost, you know, that sort of thing. So I don't expect to find that. But let me just tack on one comment to what you said. What Professor Bitak has shown is we have a significant Semitic-speaking population from their material culture. Now, we don't know in some of those houses that he has found, the smaller hovels and so on, were these Hebrews or who they were, because there's nothing in them to say, Hebrews lived here. Nothing like that. So,
do we even know if they went by the name Hebrews at the time?
They may have. They may have. Again, we have the term Israel being used by Pharaoh Merneptah at the end of the 13th century. So that term was used. And there's something very interesting about even that use of Israel, which is worth mentioning. And that is that Egyptians treat foreign cities and cities in general. The word city in Egyptian is actually a feminine word. So cities and people groups are usually referred to in feminine form. But Israel is referred to in masculine form, which is interesting. Did they recognize that behind the name Israel was a man?
Interesting. Thank you, Dr. Hoffmeier.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for a wonderful evening. Jim, for your excellent presentation and for your commitment to scholarship and to Scripture. And Mark, thank you for your support for LCU and for making this event possible.